to another episode of the Best Book Club. I'm your host, Nu Fatora, and this is the podcast where I discuss the best stories with the best minds in the community. On this episode, I'll be discussing Cara's Choice by Hans Gutherson. With me, I have the writer of this story, Hans Gutherson. Thank you for joining me.
So glad to be back. My favorite podcast with my very good friend, Nu Fatora. Always
It's
fun.
always fun talking with you about all these different stories. So, to start, I have a summary. A single choice causes a chain reaction of bullying to explode, irrevocably changing a school as some capitalize on the opportunity, some are swept into devilish plans, and all are given wedgies.
I love it. Yeah, it sounds like a bunch of my stories when you think about it. Choices leading to school-wide wedgie wars, pretty much.
Yeah.
Nice. I
So
like that. Thank you.
this was first posted on Lucky Fetish on October 13th, 2015, in one of the big short
Mhm.
story threads. And then it was later posted on DeviantArt on March 16th, 2017, and collectively it has 50,000 views.
Nice.
So I'm curious how the story came about.
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's been a while since I had to think about it because when we talk about my stories or stories that are well known, like in the community, Cara's Choice never comes up. No one's
Mhm.
ever come to me and be like, "Man, Cara's Choice, my favorite Hans Gutherson story. This is the best." Like, no, it never happens. Uh, it's funny because this I was 2015, as you noted. Obviously, very busy time for me. We've talked about that in depth in terms of Lucy and Daniela, teacher wedgie fight, YWNR, all 2015. Very prolific, busy year for me. I don't think I really topped that year in some ways. Um, and then you have this kind of like unknown short little story. I was at a point where I was basically like taking requests. I put it out there pretty publicly, like, people, you can send me prompts, you can send me ideas, and I'll write a story for you. I was just feeling creative, but also wanted to see if people would give me ideas. I don't recall getting a bunch of them. I know when I had, for example, done it on Wedgie Haven, I was able to get a good number of stories once people saw I was serious and was writing these FM stories, and I was able to create like a collection of them. On Lucky Fish forums, I don't think I got a ton, but I did get this one from Cara, aka Cara 1692, who basically, as I recall, gave me some details of what they wanted to see. They want some humiliation, they want some embarrassment, and some like basic prologue ideas for a story, basically. So I remember writing this back then in 2015, and I believe I sent it to them, and there's just like no response or anything from them on it. So I was just like, okay, I'm gonna post it because, as I've always said, if you write something, you gotta share it. No real point in keeping it secret. So I did that because it's on the short story thread. It's hard to gauge like what kind of success it had, if any, if people really enjoyed it, how many of the views for like that story contribute to overall. I know Anime Panties quite enjoyed it, and a few others really liked it. Um, so I was able to keep, like, I was inspired definitely to keep writing after that sort of shorter story success. And obviously, yeah, it started out as a very short story. This what became the prologue of a larger story, but it was basically very short. A girl goes into a change room and gets bullied. It's sort of an obvious like catalyst for a lot of our fantasies. I think very simplistic, and then from there it was like a year later or something. No, not even. It was like a couple months, I guess. Yeah, a couple months only when I was it feels like it was longer, but only a couple months later I'm back on Lucky Fish forums in 2015, adding to it and
Mhm.
basically giving it its own thread and building out a story where she gets friends and she gets Sophie, there's this crazy sadist who's really like a psycho, and this whole like plot in the end of sort of like getting revenge and what is she gonna choose to do and who is she gonna be and things like that. So Uh, I know at one point the original working title, because you know how bad I am with titles, was just Cara Revenge Story. It was all about revenge, and it's sort of like I said, even the ending was very up in the air. Like, what am I gonna do? How do I end this story? Where does it go from here? But the initial seed is certainly that first request, basically, I got that sort of spurred everything on.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I was looking for the story, I knew it was in that story thread, but then um, a thread came up for us, like, oh, maybe it's all in here, and it turned out to be way more of the story that I didn't even know existed. So, like, oh wow.
Yeah.
So there's, I was thinking we were just going to be talking about the one little that prologue, but turns out there
Yeah.
was quite a bit more for it, which was fun.
Yeah. It's a short little novella. I forget how long it was, but I think I have the number. I'm kind of anal about some of that. I like keeping track of some of that, so I believe I probably have that number somewhere. But it's probably novella-ish
Right.
length, which is very surprising because you know, in your own experience as a writer, like sometimes these stories just grow on their own, and Cara's
Hmm.
Choice is certainly one that could have ended with just the one-off short story. She's scared to change or whatever after she gets a wedgie in a change room. And how many stories like that have we read? So many that are that
Yeah.
same formula are so similar, right? You're in a
Hmm.
change room, this place where you're at your most vulnerable. It's most easy to like have a wedgie happen. So in terms of someone like me who's very interested in realism, it doesn't get more easy to kind of create a scenario that makes sense for wedgies as it is like when they're in the change room.
Absolutely.
So
And
yeah, Car's Choice. It's about it's longer than I thought it was. It's about 45,000 words.
yeah.
Uh, is what I have it at, which is only a not. It's like around what the Wedgie Killer was. Um, and like actually like maybe 10,000 words less than like a Lucy and Daniela. So certainly more
Well,
story to it
Lucien
than I
Danielle
also thought
is
there
double the
was.
length of that, actually.
I think it's like I don't know how I got this number, but I have it at 58,000 words
It's around 80
approximately.
something. It's 80 something thousand.
That's okay. So apparently I didn't count half the story somehow in the Word document. I
Yeah.
assume is where I got that number from. That or
Okay.
maybe I did the kind of foolish thing of maybe copying and pasting the, the posts from Lucky Fish forums or something into a word
Maybe.
counter. Maybe that's what I did. So
Yeah,
yeah, okay, maybe it's much longer.
it
I
is.
know Dulling a Knife is like 80K. I know YWNR is about 100,000, I think just under.
Hmm. Yeah, well, they're all long stories. That's the thing.
They
They're
are
all long,
longer
they're long
ones.
stories.
Like
Um,
they
and
are
and
surprisingly long. Car's Choice
I
is my point,
thought
but yeah.
originally it was a sequel, like that extended part of it. The part you wrote after the original idea, I suppose. And as far as I've seen, sequels are a pretty rare thing in the community.
Yeah.
Kind
Yeah, that's
something like
fair.
Chaos Recon comes to mind with their expanded universe. I don't know if they're really
Yeah.
sequels or not, but why do you think people generally stick to new ideas more than sequels or prequels? And do you do
Yeah, that's a
sequels?
good question. Yeah, it's a great question because you're right. We don't see a lot of it for the most obvious reason to get that out of the way is like because people don't even finish their first story, or like if they do, they don't get continued much because they're not writing much in general. But beyond that kind of obvious sad factor of like a lack of productivity or whatever we want to call it, yeah, I feel like a lot of times people just move from story to story. They have some fresh idea, something new they want to try and do. I mean, maybe that's a trend we're starting to see because if you think about Friend Sessions, it's basically a spiritual successor to Two Worlds slash sequel is what I would call it. And that's why I tell everybody you have to read Two Worlds before you read Friend Sessions because to me it's basically a sequel. Um, and I mean, we've talked at length about why I didn't write a sequel for Lucy and Daniela yet. Maybe one day I still will. You never know.
Still
I'm
include
not
the
someone who's
yet.
like, exactly, exactly. I'm not the type of person who like maps out my whole life and is like, I'm never gonna do this. I'm never gonna do that. Because I don't know. You never know when.
Yeah.
you're gonna have an amazing idea and you're gonna want to write it, or you're just gonna want to try it and see, even if it bombs. I think a lot of times, because I mean, when we think about sequels too, we have these expanded universes that do exist and are quite popular in the community that we could look at as like just a episodic sequence of sequels piled on top of one another until you get a universe. So I'm thinking about like the Edgeweiverse or the world or brand IP, whatever you want to call it, franchise that Between Two Cheeks made, obviously for Ashley and Luna, the go-to example when we're talking about building something out through sequels and stories. And those are very loose sequels, but through them generally you get some character development, especially in some of the longer form stories, like their Wedgie War arc that they did. But I mean, Magni Pulse is a good example of somebody who has some stories that have carried on, and again, a universe. And that's typically, I guess, for what some of the bigger writers do, is they build out universes more than like one-off sequels. And I'm no exception
Yeah.
to that, because Cara's Choice does, though kind of loosely, and you're probably going to have a better feeling of this after having just sort of gone through it, of how it fits into my broader sort of universe. I was looking for like the Tracy Easter egg to see if I dropped her in there, but I didn't spot it yet. So I can't remember if she's in it. I wouldn't be surprised if she snuck her way in, or if there was some other characters who cameoed in there, for example.
Yeah.
But no, so certainly like there's a lot of, for me, stories that kind of connect, like YW and our teacher Wedge fight Lucy and Daniela, all set in the same world, same school, basically. They all exist, although in different time periods in some ways.
Yeah.
And you can look at them kind of like sequels, and some stories I've done in kind of sequels. And I mean, even more modern day, more obvious examples is Shadow and I Have Ideas, Shao Melder, that is ideas for like a Dulling a Knife sequel, which we were very excited about, and a Flame Over Darkness sequel, which we mapped out in pretty great detail as well. So, yeah, a sequel is something that interests me a lot. It's definitely a challenge just in terms of sequel rules, like how do you up the stakes? How do you make it bigger and better, which is kind of what you need? How do you keep it fresh? It's a challenge in a lot of ways, and something you're certainly right, we don't see explored or really meta analyzed much. What do sequels and Wedgie fiction look like? Because some of our favorite stories, right? The like Luckily Unlucky Sore Winner. We don't have a Sore Winner 2 to look at. We don't have like a
Yeah. Well,
Blood
it's
Money 2.
we don't even have a finished sore winner, so
Exactly right.
yeah.
Exactly right. Exactly right. So I think it's in some ways maybe a growing, I suppose, area of it, discounting the sort of shared universes and universe brands that we have that are very loosely connected. Straight up sequels are certainly a rare breed in the community. I would argue.
Absolutely. Yeah. Tracy yourself does not show up, but some other people do.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what I thought. It's too
Yeah.
bad. Tracy, my favorite.
Yeah.
I love
Well,
Tracy.
so until this episode, I only ever read the original story.
Yeah.
What made you decide to continue it and then merge the two into one work?
Yeah, I think it was always meant to be a continuation of the story,
Mm,
very clearly, just like adding to it.
right.
A case of like, I didn't know if I looked at it like, oh, this is a sequel, so much as like the next chapter in what was meant to be probably a much larger story. And that's partly because I've always been someone who falls for scope creep really easily. I go, oh, but this could go in so many directions. And back 2015, I wasn't afraid to just write out all what those directions could be, uh, and really just embrace that. So when I saw the great feedback on the first chapter, and there were some really nice comments from people saying they would really like a sequel, like my friend B. Walsh, who, although they love everything, I haven't seen them not like a story. They praised it very highly. Fugglehorn, who wrote some very popular stories as well, the Mercy High
Oh yes.
series, I remember. which had some very good scenes in them that I recall. They liked it, and others, Anime Pains included, as I mentioned. So seeing that, I'm still sort of, I was really, I think, inspired. Like I really should continue this. People like it. You know how that like external fulfillment we've talked about drives me. So I think there's
Yeah.
that. Plus, it wasn't hard to think like, oh yeah, I could go a bit deeper into Cara's character. She's a victim here, but what if there's some other elements to her, and I can be more realistic with the wedgies, and I can make Sophia kind of psycho, and like where's the line there? Uh, and Amy was a character who stood out to me as this friend like character. I remember really struggling over her name. I think I picked Amy because I feel like the name literally meant friend or something. I think it
Yeah.
was something like some logic around that. Where I was like, oh yeah, that makes. And then yeah, I think my mind just totally kept going in places. Like I say, at the end of the story, I had a bunch of different ideas for the ending, and I really struggled with it. So I was gonna write a bunch of different endings, but I think at that point maybe my steam was running out and I was just like hesitating and not writing them. So I was like, I just need to like end the story. So I wonder, like looking back, if that was if I had rushed it or something, or if like I could have done it differently and or even just written out the different endings or something, or what the value even of that would have been, because we don't really get like that Clue-esque approach. I'm referring to the movie Clue, which had
Hmm.
like three different endings. And if you went when it came out in theaters, if you went to different theaters, you could see different endings, which was kind of bonkers to
That's
think
pretty
about.
cool.
It was. It's very cool. And now if you get the DVD of it, you can watch them back to back to back. And they're very entertaining to see very different endings, who the murderer sort of was. So,
Yeah.
but this idea of like alternate endings in a story, unless it's interactive, obvious exception, you
Right.
don't really get like, and here's some totally different endings to it. So that might have been a cool experiment. But it was hard for me to sort of pull off and start writing them, and like, and as I know, some of them are kind of insane. Like Cara going to jail because she accidentally kills Sophie like that. And I still picture this moment, her
Yeah.
behind bars. It's like I can still see that in my head. But I
Yeah.
mean, kind of crazy. Or Amy being an evil mastermind was another like really crazy stuff. She was
Yeah.
behind everything, and I mean, I feel like I was even then like in some horror slasher phase or some
Yeah.
evil cartoony thing. Yeah. So it was
Um,
really just a case to answer your question of the story going on in my head, and a case of like I really need to keep writing this. Like I can
yeah.
see it all happening, and it feels like a story that is easily continued. I have to like force it. We end at a point in the prologue, as I sort of retconned it to be, I guess, so to speak, of like this could really keep going, and there's more here. Um, and I want to see and examine this idea of change, I guess, in some ways.
In more ways than one.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly,
because
exactly.
you're setting it in a change room.
Yeah, yeah, totally,
A room of
totally, totally,
change.
totally.
But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I'd like to say that you're really quite talented at capturing the senses. You really make it effortless to visualize what's happening.
Oh, nice. I appreciate that. Thank you, my friend.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's. I've wondered too. Like you're someone who read like a lot of my stuff now, and you're just up on it. I wonder if I haven't gotten worse in some ways. Like I was. It's funny because like I call myself a
No,
bibliophile,
I don't
lover
think you
of books,
have.
but I was reading like some romance books, which I never read. And it's funny because I was like, if I call myself a bibliophile, I have to read these. So I was reading like Laurie Foster, and I fell in love with this book, which was super corny romance about like these two sisters who like meet these hunky dudes. And I'm reading this, I'm like, this has some really good stuff that like this could be like wedgie fish fiction, just like the top tier of like wedgie fish fiction, and just the way some of they capture some of the senses and how sensual stuff is. I'm like, it felt to me like early Lucy and Daniela, and I was like thinking about it. I was like, have I moved away from that? Like, what have I lost as I try to maybe me more cerebral, or
Yeah.
as my writing just changes, or as I evolve and maybe get cleaner? Am
Yeah,
I
well,
not like capturing some of that same stuff that I was before?
but then you
So,
also
and
have
it's
to
hard to be objective and know that for me. I really struggle with
yeah.
knowing like what's changed.
I mean, you also have to think like what have you gained by going in that direction? You have to think of that as well.
True.
It's not just all I've only you
Yeah.
haven't gotten worse. I know you haven't. You've gotten better.
That's
That's
good
all.
to know. That's
Um,
good to know. It's hard for me to tell. It's really hard for me to look and be objective and be like, "Oh yes, I know for a fact I've gotten better, and here's how." I don't have that ability as a sort of introspective and retrospective as I am spending so much time alone and in my own head. That's something I struggle with my own. But I guess it must be obvious to you and to others
yeah.
listening because it's like I'm the guy who can't edit his own work really because it scares him to think he sucks. So like, of course I'm not gonna be able to know over time if I've improved, generally, or in what ways I've have improved and what's lost in that
Mhm.
improvement. If something can be lost, in which I imagine maybe something can, I do not know.
Yeah. So I find it very interesting that despite the title, the first time choices are brought up, it's to say that Kara doesn't have a choice. The
Mm.
story really subverts your expectations within the first couple of sentences. It's great.
Yeah, it's funny because certainly when you start it, it's like the choice is pretty simply like she has to change. Is she gonna change or is she not gonna change? But even that, like, what is change? How can she change? Like, she's changing physically, obviously, but even in this kind of what is a, you would think, actually kind of scarring and very humiliating experience of getting a wedgie there, that's going to change you. And I think as we've noticed and as we've talked about, I'm someone who's very preoccupied with consequences in wedgie stories because it's not just wedgie stories where they're almost non-existent, but it's in a lot of media where you think like, shouldn't there have been something here? Should somebody have gotten in trouble for this or some? And it goes on and on. And certainly, I was thinking about that here of terms of like, wouldn't that really screw you up? Like if this were to happen to you, gang wedgie, or jumped in a locker room where you're hoping to feel safe because you're in a school environment and you're around people who you hope wouldn't do something like this to you, and then they do, and it's a pretty crazy experience. Um, and what are the consequences of that, and what happens when your choices are taken away from you, and what will you do to get them back? And what will you do when you have the choice to get revenge? And do you even have a choice at any point along this line? Does it feel like you do? I think we're always dealing with choices. I think wedgie fish fiction is a genre preoccupied with the choices of, do you inflict pain for pleasure? And it's a sort of constant question the characters face, and as writers, in some ways, to meta analyze it, look at and examine whenever they're writing a story, because that's sort of interlocked and interlinked with the fetish and what it is we take from it in some ways. But yeah, no, it's, I love that you picked up on that. I think that's a great note.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Um, I mean, choices are really what define us in life. So,
Mm, true.
it's not hard to do really well if that's what you're focusing on, and you absolutely did. So, um,
Nice. I
wow.
appreciate that.
One thing that I'm curious about is if Kara is so hell bent on preparing for the mornings and being prepared for them, why doesn't she get some of these things ready the night before, like setting aside her clothes for the morning?
Yeah, great question. I love that. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a lame answer to say it wouldn't be great for a wedgie story if she was super prepared and never had to, even if she didn't have to like really change, like she
Hmm.
just had to strip out of some of the clothes and have the outfit there ready. I imagine in some ways it maybe also wouldn't matter. Like Sophie being who she is would maybe find a way around that, as prepared as she is or could be, she'd probably still get her. And
Hmm.
is it inevitable for punishment?
Yeah.
If it's that easy that some choices she makes could save her, maybe that's the question, Like, could she have avoided this if she made different choices? And does that haunt her
Yeah.
throughout the rest of the story? uh, implicitly or explicitly.
Yeah, absolutely. If characters make the same, if characters make different choices, but they end up at the same conclusion, then
Mm,
that's kind of going into the illusion of choice, and I like that quite a bit.
yeah, true,
Uh, I,
true, true, true.
I guess going along that line of thinking, then why does she keep a pair of jeans she doesn't like? Why doesn't she get rid of them if she automatically knows she doesn't like them while putting them on?
Yeah, that's a good question. It could be a case of her just not having anything better or not having anything else, or that's just what's there. The approach of like, I don't love them, I'll get rid of them, but maybe not today. You
Hmm.
know, uh, I'll get rid of them at some point. Or again, a case of like clothes are expensive, so do you have a choice? Is that the illusion of choice there, being able to say, well, I know I don't like them, at least I don't want to wear them, but I
Yeah.
can't
Hmm.
change that. I have to wear something, so
Hmm.
at least I can choose not to like them.
Yeah,
And
that's
so these
fair.
layers of choice, the choices that mean more or less, and maybe mean everything, and we can't change reality. We can choose how we think about it.
Hmm.
And that can truly be a very revolutionary concept. And it sort of defines some of the characters in the story. As we see, Amy chooses to see people and things in a very Hans Gutherson-y positive way, at least pre-breakup, of optimism and positivity. And you don't have to be a bully. You can be someone good and happy, and that positivity can spread and things like that. While as you can choose other ways to be in more sadistic, crazy ways of like the Sophies of the world and her posse of bullies, and things like that, I think.
Definitely. Yeah, I like that. Um, and then going along with that, why doesn't she like loose clothing in general? I can understand not liking loose pants because she doesn't want anyone
Mm.
to see her underwear, but like white shirts and all that, wouldn't
Yeah.
loose clothing cover her more effectively?
Yeah, you would think so. You would think it would make her so much of a predictable and cliche wedgie target too, because they're often wearing these very tight clothes, or at least the bullies are, especially, right? The very hot, almost painted on outfits.
Yeah.
Uh, I think in some ways she's trying to figure out who it is she is, how she wants to sort of present herself. I mean, maybe she's trying to look like some of these other people who have, it
Hmm.
seems like, their lives together, and they have everything sort of tied up tightly, and secure, whereas loose clothing is like it hangs off of you. You don't have such a great connection to it. The sort of metaphorical way in which like what you're wearing sort of defines who you are, your personality, sort of thing. So maybe she wants to change exactly who she is, and how she dresses is one aspect of that. And in high school, where she is, uh, you don't have the same agency you have when you're older. And I think Cara's Choice is an example of a pretty common trope in wedgie fish fiction, which is a sort of coming of age moment, at least in my stories,
Yeah.
especially. Where's this coming of age out of one period of your life into another, and closes one aspect of like she wants to change and she wants to choose something else. And so change and choice, these two C words that we're going to keep coming back to. Uh, and Kara makes it three C's, uh, and that really do, I think, resonate throughout the telling of her life in this moment as she's really going through some stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's pretty much just all stories in general.
It's true.
As just growth in the character, they change over the course of the story. You'd hope they would, otherwise, it's probably not that good of a story.
Yeah,
There's probably some
yeah.
exceptions, but it's yeah,
I think you're right. I think change is pretty essential. There's obviously famous examples teachers love to quote, stories where characters don't change. and examples of how that can be cool. I think The Catcher in the Rye is a famous one teachers love
Yeah, and it's a
because the
terrible book.
character in that does not change the same from beginning to end. Um, and that's a story in itself and why that's the case. But certainly, I think for me, I've always been attracted to change. I think I want to know within myself I'm capable of change, that any of us are. But I think, and I hope most of us want to be better than who we were and what we've done, and we don't want our mistakes to sort of define us. We want to know we can move beyond it and become different people. Because I think growing up, and I think just in general, there's so much media that asks that question, like, can we change? And that it's a very cliche question of like, do we ever change? No one ever changes. Everybody's always the same. And I like to try and poke holes in that as much as possible in my stories, which is why Lucy and Daniela, right, is a story about change and all these sort of like coming of agey stories that I've done. It's about sort of changes in how you see yourself, how you see others, how you see the world in some ways, which generally in my early stories, 2015 era, just means being more open and free with yourself and not being scared to sort of share who you are with other people, or make friends, basically, which is something I've struggled with. So I think there's a lot of that personal biographical influence in some of the characters and motivations there.
For sure, yeah. Yeah, yeah. The motives are something I want to get into a little bit later. But yeah,
Mm.
I definitely see where you're coming from. Sophie getting mad at Cara when she didn't do anything is weirdly true to life.
Mm.
I mean, it's a decently common thing to happen for whatever reason.
Yeah.
People misdirecting their emotions. Was this something that you intentionally did?
Yeah, certainly. I feel like, and this will probably make sense to you, we see it in Karate Friends too, which had an impact on me, as you know. It's like you want that attention. You want to be the center of things when you're a bully. Very fundamentally, it's about power and this domination, and it's about processing at this age that these characters are, uh, complex emotions you're just starting to feel for the first time in some ways, and it's all mixed up with your changing mind and your changing sexuality and things. So there's going to be a lot of trying to figure all that out, and definitely displacing, misplacing, and putting your emotions, expressing them in unhealthy ways, and without even maybe realizing what you're doing. And so you get characters like Judy, who's kind of crazy, uh, and Sophie, and things, and really just these kind of, in some ways, really struggling characters, I think, who probably don't even realize the harm they're doing or how their choices do affect other people. Or maybe just in a case, and I know this is something I've thought a lot about, is the idea of they feel good when they make other people feel bad, right? That most basest of pleasures, which I think we all feel in some ways, sick and as saddening as it is. I think we understand that that is the easiest and cheapest way to sort of feel good when you're not thinking too much about it. That we can do that, and we might occasionally feel a bit better for it. But then we're going to feel bad, hopefully, if we have consciences and things, and we have regrets. We're going to feel ashamed about it later. But I just think we've all been at a point where we are able to think and feel so many different things and not know what's right and what's wrong, and do things that hurt others, um, at a time when we think we're doing the right thing. So we get like the twist in Cara's choice where she's betrayed, and we get things like Cara going through these feelings of what is she gonna do? Is she gonna get revenge? Um, and the other characters just picking on her so like maliciously, while Amy sort of is the one like pinnacle of like self-control and maturity, who's probably wise beyond her years and wise beyond what a wedgie story would allow for a high schooler who's quoting like a Catholic philosopher. I didn't even remember why, but I caught that in the story, Edwin Hubble Chapin. I was like, who is that? Who is this? Why was I having her quote him? But then I found one quote that I feel like was probably what I was thinking of, where it was like, never does the human soul appear so strong as when it foregoes revenge and dares to forgive an injury. He has a
Hmm.
bunch of other quotes, this philosopher, but that, looking over his quotes, he was like a clergyman in the 1800s. That might have been what Amy was gonna quote to Cara in that scene where she's trying to convince her, like, you don't need to give wedgies, you don't have to get revenge after you were like so brutally bullied. Um, so it's certainly, I think, deliberate and sort of even a question and something I struggle with and think a lot about today, of like, how do you make that realistic? How do you, because that's what it usually is. It is this displaced pain and hurt and anger, as we know, is just a shield for a deeper emotion. Like whenever someone's feeling anger, there's something behind it, something real behind it, and it's about going deeper. And that's what I think writing partly is finding the truth in why
Hmm.
people do what they do.
Yeah, and it comes down to making a choice there as well
Mm.
of whether you're going to
Yeah.
take that revenge or not.
Yeah.
Now, normally I deride having a break in the story just to give some description of a character, but it makes sense in the context of Kara being lost in her thoughts while paralyzed in a locker room. Like it
Mm.
fits there. Like you actually made it work, but normally people don't make it work. They just shove it in.
Yeah. It's something I struggle a lot with, as you know, just character descriptions. Like I'll go whole stories, if unless I think about it consciously, be like, what does a character look like? Did I not say? Or what are they wearing? I'll just be like, and the hot. If I even say that, and then the character, and I'll give them a first name, never a last name, because apparently that's too much work. And they do things, and it's like, wait a minute, did I ever say what they look like? And that was something I was very much like preoccupied with, like, do I explain them well enough? And I know it's something I've seen other wedgie fish writers question, how do I do it without just doing the cliche? And we've talked about this, right? We've talked about how we do it without doing the I'm looking in the mirror approach and describing myself, which is super
Yeah.
cliche. Or I'm looking at a reflective surface, was a joke we made right
Hmm.
previously. And it's so true. So it's certainly hard for me to do it. Um, Especially because, like, I want it to feel real, and how real is it to break from whatever cool action is happening to be like, and this character had a hot body, and they looked like that, and they had hair that was this. I mean, because it's so common to have these descriptors, and it is important to have it. It just feels like a really hard art form
Hmm.
to break it and to put it in there without interrupting the narrative too much. And
Yeah.
because there's a lot you could describe, to your point about the just the physical senses, like you could describe so much stuff about a character in great depth. And so in my experience now, it's about weaving it in, and you don't have to do it all at once. You really don't.
Hmm.
You can bring stuff in later and try and really, especially less important stuff, what they smell like or something, or even their eye color. Maybe you don't notice their eye color till later in it, but and it's brought in a way that's kind of significant to the story. Like when they're much closer, the character notes they can see their eyes or something and what they look like, and how they hadn't seen them before, but up close they're stunning and stuff like. I feel like I really am like a Nora Roberts, Laurie Foster writer now, like just after reading those books, just how the pro best-selling romance writers do it. You'll
Yeah.
see next stories I write, they'll be pure, like great, beautiful romances with some wedgies thrown in. People living on
Yeah.
a farm, animal rescue people, like classic Laurie Foster. It'll just be the Somerset Girls, which is a Laurie
Okay.
Foster book I read, which was awesome. It'll just be that with wedgies
Okay.
tossed in.
Okay. Yeah, that's Romance does seem to be a pretty overarching topic for a lot of people, but I don't know
Mm.
of anybody who really just focuses on it.
Yeah. There's certainly I know so many different approaches. I mean, we've talked about the sort of like playwright, if we even want to call it that, the play example of like you have a line in the beginning of the story or a couple lines. This is what they look like in a paragraph, and then you'll have usually then their name and then the text and then the name and the text. It's like, and I will enjoy reading that kind of story, as we've said. Um, so I would usually, like I said, fall on the side of the spectrum of like very little detail it felt like and what characters look like, and I would look back and be like, I feel like I could have done more to explain what they look like. And, um, while others sometimes their physical features is all we get of them,
Hmm.
right? And that's kind of common, as well as maybe a couple identifying characteristics. Like uh, I'm thinking of Sandra from Sasita's stories, who's has a huge butt and wears goth underwear with bats and likes tacos. Like that's and she's got and we hear about her giant moons all
Yeah.
the time, and she has her girlfriend, and that's about all we get from her. And there's no great development unless it has something to do specifically with wedgies, as we see like the character Mercy in those stories, who her only development is like not being queen of wedgies or something
Hmm.
at one point, and it's like their lives revolve around it. And so
Yeah.
certainly a very different kind of story, certainly very enjoyable. As you know, I love those stories, huge fan of them, but very different
Yes,
from
absolutely.
like the sort of stories I'm writing generally. Although I've done, as you know, like an Alice story, all about the character Alice, and although I probably not super popular because most of the story I spend in her head and how examining how she's not as dumb as people think she is, um, and things of that nature.
Hmm.
But yeah, certainly we get those cases where the physical characteristics are the defining like traits of the character, and that's what we see and we hone in on over and over again. And we really don't need to know much about who they are beyond what they look like. It's
Yeah.
kind of it's familiar, but it's kind of it becomes a bit problematic when that's all we're seeing,
Yeah. We need variety. We need diversity.
for sure.
So bringing it
Yeah.
back to Kara's choice, after having been chastised for simply lobbing a comment at Kara, why does Sophie think going way farther is the way to get the girls back on her side?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it mostly comes down to characterizing Sophie in some ways. She's such the opposite of like a Cara, who's kind of in the middle between like an Amy on the totally other side of it, who's like innocent to a fault and naive, and Sophie, who really sort of sees nothing but pleasure from hurting other people and deriving that sort of sick pleasure from inflicting pain. And as I said, that's sort of at the heart of what wedgie fetishism is kind of all about in some ways. So I think she really is supposed to like typify what that looks like when someone isn't being stopped, when other people around her aren't choosing to stop her, or just be like, Sophie, you're a little obsessed with these wedgies, you know? She doesn't have that kind of person to question her or stop her. So she's kind of like the fetish out of control in some
Mm.
ways and represents that when she really feels like she has to give them, and that is the only choice that can be made, really. Uh, so, unlike like an Amy who thinks that's never the choice you make, and Kara who doesn't know if that's the choice you make, because that's what your enemies are using. Do you use the tool of your enemy? Do you try and talk to them? Do you avoid them? Like, how do you get something like this to stop? Do you try and start your own rebellion, as Kara does, for example? and end things, or basically take the power back, give yourself agency. Um, when Sophie has such an iron grip on it, and she's probably trying to make an example of Cara too. She goes very much out of her way to organize a lot so that she's the one undoubtedly sort of in power until the end when everything blows up.
Yep.
And we have the big war, and she really can't keep a handle on it all. It's kind of like this dictatorship of Wedgie's kind of falling. Kind of funny to think about too that I've had this kind of like ideas around like almost political quasi governmental wedgie structures in my mind, and now I have this, as you know, the idea for that much bigger fantasy story, which would basically be uh at least one kingdom, queendom, whatever we want to call it, that would be very much focused on wedgies once the evil, quote unquote evil queen sort of reshapes it
Hmm.
in what her idea of like a paradise would be. So it's kind of funny that I guess this, because as you know too, kind of tangentially, it's like this idea of mob mentalities has been something that's really fascinated me. It's why a lot of times we have these groups who are like on the sides, who are cheering on the wedgies, right? Not just because that's hot to think about that added group embarrassment, but because I really am interested in like the sociology of like how people interact and are they different in a group, and like if Sophie were to have jumped Cara not in a change room, in a girls only environment that's closed off and kind of like a microcosm, would things have played out differently in the beginning?
Hmm.
Would somebody have stopped her, or did no one stop her because no one stopped her? You know, like these questions fascinate me, and I'm very much interested in examining that sort of aspect of things. I think in a lot of my stories.
Yeah, it definitely shows up. It's
Yeah.
very, very evident in what you write. So I think you're doing a good
Yes.
job of exploring them.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Sophie's motives make sense, but some of the things she says are so
Yeah.
reminiscent of Elizabeth from Blood Money by Nicely Done,
Mm,
insofar as they're creepy. Like,
yeah.
Sophie wants to assault Kara instead of bully her. Like
Yeah.
this, I will leave you alone, but I think I want to see more of your underwear. Like, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, okay, Sophie. What's up? What's really going on there?
Yeah. What is going on there? Is she secretly gay or something and hasn't come to terms with it, kind of thing, and or sees this as a way to like really pick on her victims by making them very uncomfortable, in this very creepy fetishistic way that she has about her. You know, no,
Yeah,
totally. It's a good observation.
it's weird. Um, where do you think the trope of bullies keeping the torn waistbands from their victims' underwear originated?
Oh, that's a fun question. I think looking back off the top of my head, I know I was obviously doing it in Lucy and Daniela, but that I must have come from somewhere. I'm trying to think where I would have maybe seen that first, where I would have been inspired by. I know most of them don't. Like Daniela had like a whole drawer full of them. I feel like to speak more generally, and I'll see if I can recall something off the top of my head in terms of collection. It's a very fascinating idea in terms of keeping trophies. When we think about the wedgie fetishist as this kind of deviant, almost I'll say serial killery aspect to it, where you're going around giving victims wedgies and things. You're going to be keeping trophies, and it's kind of a humiliating, embarrassing thing. And to keep a token of it is to show you have some power. You have the sort of evidence to, I guess, technically have them like blackmail them with it, or have them be remembered and have it come up again and again and again, for example, which isn't really how it's used, but would be kind of cool if it were used in that way. If someone were to have given a wedgie and then used it later on the same pair. to blackmail, for example, or something like that. I think in a lot of ways it's to show that this isn't the first time someone's done it, that they enjoy having this power and the evidence of it, and to show a trophy taken from their victim, which I must go back all the way to anything from even kind of fascinatingly the socio-political like of scalping
Hmm.
from America. You would think too. It's kind of obviously not at all the same, but it has a sort of odd resonance to
Yeah.
it, where you're taking this trophy and you're obviously showing off what you've done and being able to have proof of what you've done to someone. And I mean, also the other resonance is a simpler idea of like when you have sex with somebody or something, you keep their underwear if you're vanilla and not like us, and not keeping it for the reasons we would keep it, or not keeping a piece of it, which is more typical of a wedgie fetishes, or a
Mhm.
ripped underwear pair. Just keeping the whole thing because it's usually given to you or something, or as just a reminder. Or and even the films of like the 70s, 80s, right? The 16 Candles sort of movies, where it's like, oh man, the dude got her underwear. It's proof he actually had sex with her. Um, or he asked her to keep it, is often the case in those kind of movies, and she would give it to the nerdy guy, and he could say, "Look, I had sex with the hot chick." So a lot of reasons to sort of have it given and shared, which range from, as we just examined and argued, potentially the very crazy trophy keeping, which has a long history, or just the fact of like it's more embarrassing to keep it than just have it sort of break and fall to the ground. I mean, it's got to go somewhere. Could just go in the garbage, but having the bully want to keep it and have a collection and look back at it, a la Daniela, for example. It's a kind of fun way to also characterize them in some
Mhm.
ways
Definitely. Yeah.
as
It's like
well. It's
they're
a great
trying.
question though. That's a deep and fascinating question. You could
Yeah.
write a whole essay on that.
I think you just spoke the entire thing. But yeah, I'm just trying to hold on to some kind of piece of the acts to verify that it actually
Yeah,
happened, that the past is real, that
yeah,
it exists somewhere, somewhen.
yeah. That your choices matter, right? That there's
Yeah.
consequences to the actions,
Hmm.
and it's something you can touch and hold and look back on,
Yes.
and it's like an evidence of your power.
Yeah.
I think as well, in a very
Yeah.
simpler bullying aspect. Yeah, this is great. This is awesome to think about.
Definitely. And I believe I caught something, whether it's a
Yeah,
continuity error or a difference in two
probably.
characters' viewpoints.
Yeah,
The prologue has this line: "She might not have been
yeah.
super popular, but she knew and was friends with most of the girls there." Then in
Hmm.
part one, it says, "And secondly, Cara was, for a reason Sophie couldn't understand, quite popular." So is she popular or is she not that popular?
Yeah. I mean, I could spell it out for you. I feel like what you're reading there too is Sophie's perspective
That's kind of
of
what I was
Cara.
wondering, if it was that.
Exactly, right? That's what it's meant to be, because we it literally goes into her perspective there and saying Sophie and her thoughts. And I mean, it gives her another reason to want to pick on her, because she sees someone who could be vying for her spot, who others could like, and she wants to sort of knock her out of that. Um, Clearly, we see she doesn't have a problem making some friends. She really just has Amy, though, who we see most. So
Yeah.
she's not someone who's surrounded, obviously, by a gang of girls who would jump to her defense, for example,
Hmm.
when Sophie picks on her. So we can assume from that, and we can see it without me having to tell you, she's not like the most popular. They don't
Right.
instantly make a wall in front of her or right away come to her side consoling her, and be like, "Oh, that's Sophie, such a
Yeah.
bitch, I'm going to get her back. I'm going to report her." We don't see any of that, right?
No,
Which
the
I think implies and is a kind of subtle detail that she's not queen of the school, but she obviously has a very deep and close relationship with Amy, and some others who are sort of around her generally. And I think maybe it's even just that very deep and powerful friendship she has with Amy and her other close friends that Sophie probably envies, and that's probably partly where she says she sees her as being popular for
Yeah.
reasons she can't understand, because she has these deep, real friendships where, like, she has underlings who are probably scared of her, which is a very wedgie fetishy trope and also a Hans Gutherson staple, at least in the 2015 days, where we get, like, those bullies who are just sort of around, and it's karate friends, too, right? Goes back
Mhm.
to that, with the two who are just hanging out around Angelica. Uh, who are just her cronies until they find out Angelica's a nerd,
Yeah.
and how fickle people can be. And it's a very cliched thing. I think some of these characters are definitely painted and seem more like TV esque, like sitcom characters who, like
Absolutely.
in Lucy and Daniela, it's kind of deliberate, right? The characters who just say OMG a lot. And I was thinking about them the other day. That's their one like shtick thing that they do is go around saying it. And they are these sort of like crony esque characters who,
Yeah.
if you think about it, aren't certainly the most realist characters I've ever written or feel particularly interesting, like in terms of depth, although they are kind of fun and cartoony, which is certainly a big craving in the community.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I was kind of wondering if that was the case, so I'm glad you were able to confirm that.
Yeah, I appreciate you asking. No, totally. Because I know certainly I don't make it the most obvious sort of move to Sophie thinking about it there. And her perspective. And that's the thing of like when if you're maybe trying to show and not tell something, and that example certainly is not the strongest showing not telling example. It can be tricky for me to be like, is this clear enough, or what am I do? How do I leave this more open so that people can read into it? So I'm glad you're asking these questions and that you're
Absolutely.
curious about some of this. It's awesome.
Yeah. A huge
So
trope that I've been aware of probably since I first joined the community
mm,
is underwear being described as a thong or a thick thong during a
yeah,
wedgie. And
sure,
it's such a classic wedgie literature descriptor.
yeah.
I'm curious why you think people have stuck with the same descriptions for so long.
Yeah, it's the question of why do people keep saying it cuts like a knife? Like,
Yeah.
why?
Or feels like a
Why after
rope
the
or
first
burns
time?
like a
Feels like a
fire or
rope, burns like a fire. I
sitting
mean,
on a
you would
bed
have
of
seen it.
nails. There's all kinds
You
of.
would have seen it reading it when I did that. I always bring this up to you whenever I can. That metaphor of like the duck thing that dips its head
Mm-hmm.
up
Yep.
and down. You would have seen that in this story. I was so proud of that when I came up with it because I was like, oh man, that's so good and that's so unique. No one else has ever described a wedgie like that. I mean, sometimes, when you're writing and you're rushing through it, you're just trying to put down something. You don't want to
Right.
break the flow too much. If that's your style, I know as I've said, there's like the Canadian writer Alistair,
Cade.
whose last name I totally blanked on,
Alistair Cade.
who would no, no, not a wedgie fish writer. I do love
Oh.
Alistair
Oh.
Cade. Alistair, it'll come to me. Not a fetishist writer, unfortunately. I
Okay.
think I mentioned them to you before. And I'll see if I can come back to it. But basically, Alistair McLeod. I knew something
Mm.
like that. And their whole thing, if I'm remembering this right, is like they would not move on to the next word in their story until they were made sure the word they had was perfect. So they literally
Okay.
go word by word, making sure. Like that's how meticulous.
Mm-hmm.
Not like me, who it's like, oh, I can come back to that later. I edit it, I write a bunch. So every single word had to be perfect before they moved on. And like
Wow.
that level of attention to detail. So but he's being a crazy exception rule. So for most of us, I imagine it's a case of like you're writing something, you need maybe a placeholder, or you haven't read as much as like you have, for example, and you think, oh, I remember reading that once and it was okay, and maybe I'll put a slight twist on it. I say it feels like a different kind of rope, or I say it feels like thread, or I say it feels like a wire instead of rope because I've seen rope, so I won't say rope again. But then you realize wire's been used, and
Yeah.
You say, oh, instead of, because I remember early days, 2015, I would have a thesaurus out and looking at it for synonyms for, like, for, it wouldn't be wedge, but that was one of the words. But instead of like grinding, I'll look up synonyms for that. And, and so finding different words to describe it. And I've said to you, right, and I bring this up constantly. I need to come up with new lines, but I've said that one of the main things I've seen for people when they leave the community and writers who just stop writing stories is they say, I've done it all. Like, there's only so many ways you can describe a wedgie, and I've done it. I've written one or two or three stories, and I've literally mined all the ways you can possibly describe it, is what some of these writers say. And I'm paraphrasing them, obviously, but that's the gist of it. For some of them, they say like, hey, there's not many ways you can do this and describe a wedgie. So I'm done. I'm moving on, and that's a very common thing I've seen. So it's certainly a struggle to come up with new ways to describe what generally is the exact same act that happens in the same basic movement and order of steps. Grab the underwear, pull the underwear. And you can spice that up and you can color it. But when you reduce it down, it really is a very familiar act that can become very familiar. And the thesaurus can only get you so far, as I learned, and you can also fall into the trap I've done where I go so far afield trying to describe stuff in metaphors and similes. Um, and do you maybe try like the romancy approach? And what I, funnily enough, was doing again in those early stories of being kind of vague, especially when stuff got sexual. I wouldn't say, oh, they came or whatever. I'd be like, they brought them to a place or whatever,
Yeah.
which is very romance novelty, as I've just realized after reading some of them. I thought I was being like revolutionary in how like prudy I was being and prudish at the time, because I was, when I was younger, I was like, I don't want to talk about dicks. It come in like, ooh, yuck. Um, Whereas now it's certainly, that's not really the case. I've become more vulgar, I guess, so to speak. Um, but certainly it's so common, these tropes and these cliches, and it's become such a thing that's not hard to parody them. And I mean, Anime Panties did such a great job of it in his like wedgie story, and the sequel that he did. It's such a fun thing to see these parodies too. On a side note, and I wish we had more of them because it's so easy to do because there's such an abundance of tropes and the obvious ones that you pick up on, but it's easy to forget, like how common some of them are, like
Yeah.
rope and the moons, like we mentioned, or wire, or even just like how it burns or it scolds, and the list goes on. And if you can pick a word and you could pick a handful of synonyms, you'll have described a great number of ways that writers have described wedgies over the years.
Yeah. That was a very packed thought. I like it. It's very good.
Yeah, it's another amazing question. I don't know how you come up with such great questions. This is wonderful.
It's just they just come to me as I'm reading. That's all.
That is a gift. That is a gift.
I think the most human and grounded piece of the story is Judy and Stephanie's conversation while at the park.
Mm,
It's so genuine with how they're describing people. They're revealing their intentions aren't all the up and up, in that they're also trying to save their own asses, literally, instead of being randomly good and perfect people. And especially with the pauses they take in their speech. I mean, so many people don't realize or understand the power and humanity of a good pause in speech.
mm,
How often has
yeah,
it been that what someone hasn't said is more potent than what was said? You just
yeah,
listen to a conversation and pauses happen all the time.
yeah,
It's great to make your characters super eloquent and all, but if you don't have those pauses, they'll just sound like robots if read aloud. So I
yeah,
use pauses.
yeah. Yeah, it's such a beautiful thing. And I mean, I have such a deeper appreciation too for actions and pauses and that which goes unsaid than I did when I was younger and even 2015. So yeah, I love that you note this conversation because it feels kind of more real. And I had a thing, I think, for a lot of ellipses, a lot of three dots in between speeches. I probably overused them the early times, but like some of the obvious stuff I'm thinking of now is like NYPD Blue, which I love to reference now because I love that series so much, and it's just such great writing. And I mean, there's moments in that series where there's silence and there's pauses, and I mean, people they talk more real in my mind than they do in like a lot of my stories where every thought is like very carefully like articulated and it's very clear and sometimes they monologue, it's like they go on, and I mean, Shadow's been trying to break me of that habit in stories we did, like Dulling a Knife and stuff. It's like, don't have them go on and on. Like, characters are going to jump in conversations. People are usually going to jump in. Or
Yeah,
they're
they're
going
gonna
to
interrupt each
say
other.
you're
They're not gonna
talking
know
too
what they're
much.
saying. They're gonna
Exactly.
it's gonna be all kinds
It's
of
so
stuff.
true. They're not going to know. They're going to start a thought. They're going to ramble off. Someone's going to cut them off and say, well, anyways, try and get them back on track, as happens to me all the time because I'm used to rambling and stuff. But certainly it's such an important thing to have pauses. You're absolutely right. It's something that's not hard to do, but you'll notice in real life, certainly people. It's not like the movies. They're gonna interrupt each other. They're gonna talk over each other and things. And so even when I was like for a little bit, there was like a summer I was basically working in this like film festival, very small film festival out where I live, and we were sort of making a small movie. I don't think it even got finished, short film we were working on.
Mhm.
But and that was the one thing that the sort of person who ran the festival also did some screenwriting said they were like you gotta have it so you're kind of talking a little over each other, which is true to life. You don't finish and have a pause before the next line, like you just going like that's
Yeah,
conversation and it's
conversation
more
isn't turn
real.
based.
Exactly right. I love that. I love that. So yeah, and it's very hard to do it right, but hearing how people actually talk and listening to people is great
Yes,
research. Absolutely.
absolutely.
If you're like, how do I nail that real conversation? It's listening and it's looking for good media where they do talk real and the way they say stuff is cool and it sounds good, and
Or
there's
you
countless good TV and movies for
just
that as well.
there's also just you just walk outside and have a conversation with somebody.
Yes. It's
That's the
true.
best
It's
way.
true. It's true. The way I'm describing it is like you have to hide in the back and listen, very introverted, which is very me and very how I would do it. You're right, just talking to people,
Yeah.
having conversations,
Yes.
and it's how you become a better writer is by talking to people. Absolutely.
And by reading, but yeah. Now, this line, Kara didn't know how the girls could laugh so easily when it seemed to Kara that the only thing between her being a wedgie maniac and simply being her was nothing but a choice. It's so
Mm,
fantastic because as we've spoken on a little bit before, that's really all that separates us. I mean, our
yeah.
choices are what define who we are. So, yeah, I love that you captured that.
Yeah. I imagine too, if you look at the number of times I use the word choice, I probably overdo it, or this idea of like what choices does she have? I mean, it's funny because not long after that, I make a note something like the undies had no choice but to rise up as well, taking the bully with them. So I mean, what has choices, what doesn't? I mean,
Hmm.
uh, so yeah, I'm glad that there's these lines that stick out to you, and I'm
Absolutely.
glad it's not like an overused thing where you're like, man, Hans, you couldn't stop talking about choices every couple minutes, because I wouldn't have been surprised if that's also kind of the case.
Yeah. So far, it doesn't seem like that is the case. So I think you're
I'm
all right.
glad, yeah, because I was still like a in a lot of ways, I still feel like I am a new writer in 2015 times. Like I'd done Lucy and Daniela, I'd done some of these other ones, right? But in terms of someone who's truly tested and ironed things out and like we said been very intentional in realizing what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. I mean, that's still something I struggle with,
Mhm.
so I'm glad like these elements still stand up, today looking back at them, and you
Absolutely,
got
they
some
do.
enjoyment out of it.
Yeah, got a lot. You've said again and again that the biggest piece of your voice in the community is friendships formed through wedgies. Now,
Mm,
I'd like to challenge that a bit with this.
nice.
Friendships are indeed formed in your stories, yet wedgies usually tend to be the central conflict and divide characters just as much as bring them together.
True.
Would these characters be better off without wedgies ever coming into their lives? Of course, as a
Aw.
fetishist, the answer is no, but hear me out. For the
Yes,
most
please.
part, they aren't into wedgies, so with the exception of
Yeah.
characters that are into the fetish, I wonder if they
Yeah.
would have been happier without having to experience that pain.
Yeah. It's a great question. It's a fascinating question to me because I wonder, would Kara have changed as much as she did? If you believe she has, maybe you read the story, you're like, oh, Kara's the same person from beginning to end. I mean, if she hasn't been tested through the wedgies, I mean, obviously you could probably replace wedgies with any other number of things. Like if this weren't a wedgie story, Sophie could bully her in other vanilla, boring ways that no one would care about because it's not wedgies, including myself. But she probably could, and you could just be that. Or she just doesn't bully her, and she makes the choice not to. And does Kara change still, or does she have any instances where, when she's not being tested and she's not having to make hard calls, does she still have a chance to grow? Because I think adversity, as annoying and as hard and as difficult as it is, I think it is what helps us figure out who we want to be
Yeah.
and who we're going to choose to be. So, unfortunately, you have to sort of get the wedgies to decide what kind of underwear you're going to wear, to speak metaphorically.
Yeah.
Uh, and hopefully, kind of pithily and cleverly put that on my epigraph. Um, but certainly, I think that's very true. Like, as you know, I gone through my own struggles, as have you, and as much as I sort of am saddened that I have to go through these things, I feel like it is, in some ways, the truest test of character, and in figuring out like that we don't want to be someone who causes hurt to others, because we
Mhm.
know what that feels like, for example. Or we want to try and be good and better people, as much as we maybe struggle with that for whatever reason day to day. It's
Yeah.
still something we hold true to ourselves and something we know generally and genuinely we want. And I think that's sort of the one of the cliches, right? The people who've spoiled and never known pain or whatever, they grow up spoiled, and they don't sort of get the empathy maybe. And I don't really buy into that because it's a generalizations. I'm not a huge fan of those, because then the other side of that's usually like, oh, these people who are super spoiled and rich, they feel like they've been pampered and they want the freedom or something, and they want a different life. There's always going to be something. No one's ever totally happy with whatever they have, which is, funnily enough, also a generalization, but I think a truer one than like, oh, everybody who's rich is a certain way, everybody's poor a certain way, you know. But I think no matter what, we're always going to be looking for something different and wondering about how to change and what could be different. But I think being tested and challenged like Cara is with the wedgies, or as many of the characters are in my stories, it helps you figure out who you want to be, who you are, and certainly it does, in a lot of cases, drive characters apart. Pre breakup Hans, we get like Sam and Amanda and Lucy and Daniela, who are torn because of the wedgies and what they want for each other in a relationship that has wedgies in it, you know? While like post breakup, we get stories like No Wedgies Tonight, where one character has a fetish, the other doesn't, and there's a divide between them, where the man in the relationship who doesn't have the fetish, which is kind of a shift and an inversion, I guess, of this what's expected. Uh, he is kind of unhappy because he doesn't know if he can be satisfied by someone who's so singularly into one thing.
Mhm.
And she's always turned on, and how do you deal with that? And she's so into wedgies, and it's like, doesn't that get boring for him? Uh, so certainly they can drive people apart, they can maybe be something that's a core. I think certainly to your point, they're the core part of a relationship for me, for good or for bad, and it's not exclusively. And you're very smart to point this out because I hadn't thought of it before. You're certainly opening my eyes. A core part of bad, and it's not just a positive thing. Even in the 2015 pre-breakup days of where I'm way positive and happy, we even get in like YWNR, right? The splintered parental and sort of child relationships, child being used to for 18-year-olds, obviously, of their relationships because wedgies sort of split them apart, and split, pun slightly intended on split, but yeah, I think it's a great point. Certainly at the
Mhm.
core of relationships, and it has good and bad consequences, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also helps you appreciate good times and happy
Mm,
times better if you go through rough experiences.
true. Yeah,
So
it's true.
yeah, it's hard to say because
Yeah,
it happens. So
it
it's hard.
does.
It's pretty hard to say if they would have been better off without it happening because we will never know.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, and it hit me when I read this in a Stephen King short story, and the title, of course, is gonna escape me off the top of my head. But basically, in the story, and I'll come to the title, but there's a character who is able to know exactly what a woman wants, basically. And through it turns out dark magical means, basically. Um, and she realizes near the end, um, that like she could be with this guy who will always know what she's thinking and feeling, what she wants, basically read her mind, make sure she's never feeling pain. But there's a beautiful line in the story right near the end where the character realizes, and I'm gonna hope I think slightly paraphrase, but hopefully basically nail it, where it's like life is not about sailing a path around pain. And that really, when I read that, that really hit me because I was at a point where I was like, I wish I didn't have to feel sad. I wish I didn't have to deal with this pain. And I was like, that, and Stephen King was right, as usual. It's not about charting a path around pain, it's about growing with it, experiencing it, and hopefully growing because of it. And I think being able to grow with it is a true. I think it's the sort of goal and maybe the meaning of life to be incredibly profound. It's sort of what defines us as humans, and maybe is what it means to have the human condition or whatever. The struggle is just living with pain and making sure it doesn't break us, but breaking it, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. I mean, pain will be unavoidable in general. Um, so learning how to manage it and deal with it properly—that's the important thing.
Yeah, and it's so hard. It's
Yeah.
not easy.
Hmm.
Not easy at all.
No. So having Judy give Stephanie a wedgie immediately after discussing the plan to end wedgies is actually really great consistency for Judy. I mean, it's shown that she's all right with them between friends for fun. So it's a good it's a good way to punctuate their solidifying plan.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun with the sort of plots and the whole rebellion and the sort of plots within plots, and even the crazy idea that Amy would somehow be a mastermind behind all of it. It, I was certainly, when I think about it, in that Brandon Sanderson phase, because Brandon Sanderson, for those who don't know, and this may be a bit of a spoiler, he loves twists in his stories. So I read a bunch of his stuff, and I really have fallen behind because he's an insanely prolific writer who writes like it seems like 10 books a year or something insane. That's how crazy he is.
Wow.
Um, these are massive fantasy tomes. But I was reading all these twists. I was like, man, wouldn't it be cool if there was some twists here? And Cara's Choice was certainly influenced by some of that and wanting to have some of those surprises. And hopefully I got you in a couple moments. That was the goal.
Well, there's something. I'm not actually would like. I'll just say it now. I guess it was something like that. It was I'd only read the beginning before when it was posted on Lucky Fetish. Um, so when I got to the part about cheerleaders planning a wedgie war, I was thinking, wait a minute. And then Erica's name was dropped, and I lost my mind.
Yes,
I had no
Erica.
idea
Yes,
it was
Erica. That's
in
who it was.
the Lucy and Daniela universe, yet it fits
Yeah.
so well, and it's basically just more of that story and that
Yeah.
universe. So it was a wonderful surprise. So that was kind of one of those
Yeah.
things that I guess got me. It was like, oh my god, this is amazing.
I love that. That's what I wanted. Yeah, I remember the Stephen King story. By the way, is called "I Know What You Need."
Mm,
Such a so fitting title there. But yeah, no, certainly, absolutely, what I was going for with that. And whenever I throw that in,
yes.
and I've done it before, as you know, and people just don't catch it. Like when in the end of like YW and R, people were like, "Was that connected to Lucy and Danielle?" I
Yeah,
was like,
it's obviously yes.
"Yes, it was. Yes, it was."
That was
And it's
obvious because you had Daniela and like major characters named versus here is
yeah,
like Erica is a much
major
lesser,
yes,
much more
yeah,
minor
she is.
character. So
I love Erica.
it's, oh,
Yeah, Erica, I
it
love
was
Erica.
fantastic.
She's great. One of my favorites of all time. It's too bad she does come off kind of cartoony esque, and like some of the other stuff we get of her is kind of just alluded to.
Hmm.
And like she's just kind of briefly mentioned. It's like
I
I
think she's
wonder if
great.
I could do her more justice, and something of that.
I think she was done perfectly well.
Nice.
Um,
I love that.
it does bring into question then though, how does Sophie exist at the same time as Daniela? I thought Daniela was the top dog of that school. So are there like fiefdoms or something in place at this
There
school?
must
It's
be
like
a very,
split
very
up.
complex political system of the bullies where Daniela seems to be at the top, even if she's not the queen. Because even while Daniela's active, we have Amanda who has like this whole
Yeah.
system
Yeah,
of
like what
bullying
is this?
worked out. So the school is rife with bullying. I mean, it's kind of insane.
But
And I mean, it's kind of ridiculous. All the bullies operating
it's
simultaneously. I
it's
mean,
like
we see it like.
it
Go ahead,
reminds
go ahead. Yeah, please.
it reminds me of like New York with all of these heroes from
Yes.
comic books working
Yeah.
at the same time, but none of them ever run into
Yeah.
each other. Like what the fuck? How does it work?
Because the thing too happening simultaneously is the YW and R story. It's happening at the
Hmm.
same time. So somewhere in all of this
Yeah.
is Tracy and Hannah,
Yep.
and they're doing their own thing.
Yep.
So sometime during this year, very faithful, very busy year, Tracy's getting like the huge wedgie in the cafeteria. Nobody mentions. I mean, it is pretty wild to think about how much of a bullying problem this school has. And I mean, yeah, like if I ever write that interactive story I mentioned, there would be like an Easter egg, spoiler alert, where on one of the chalkboards would be the names of the teachers from Teacher Wedgie Fight with like a heart in between their names
Hmm.
to make it clear like they're teachers at this same school.
Yeah,
Like
even
they
though it never
teach at a
seems like it.
school. No, there's apparently no teachers nowhere except for the one Lucy and Daniela's teacher who makes them do one weird essay.
Yes. Yes.
That's about all she does, and then monologues to
Yeah.
Daniela about being a
Yeah.
bully. Yeah, that's about all the interaction teachers have at the school. So, but there would be a little thing
Where
that like
are
those
they?
teachers are also there. Where are they? Where are they indeed? Be funny maybe during the interactive war story where like it's set during just that what would have to be right, and I've said this, just a couple minutes, right? It could be much more than a couple
Yeah.
minutes. This ginormous school-wide wedgie war
Yeah.
before somebody shut it
Yeah.
down, right? You gotta
Yeah.
think. So what would only have to be a couple minutes, logically, realistically, there would be this whole story going on with a totally different character, totally different bullies is what I have mapped out,
Yeah, all
trying
this
to
shit's
avoid getting
happening.
wedgied. Yeah, it's gonna be a very busy, very
It's
hectic
crazy.
school. You got to think, but there's a
Yeah.
couple hundred people in the school. You would think this is also where it gets complicated in the senior class, where characters aren't underage. that would be a huge number,
Yeah.
probably,
Yeah.
compared to an entire school. That number wouldn't be ginormous. Presumably, pretty much everybody would kind of know of each other. Because
Yep.
if your school's anything like my high school, you probably had classes with most of the people at some point, you know?
Mm,
So, kind of
uh,
funny to think about some of those logistics.
yeah.
Maybe it's a very massive school. Maybe it was like four schools coming together at some point. I'll have to explain it.
Maybe.
I'll have to
Maybe.
write like a lore book, you know, like a tome explaining all the lore and deep history of
I mean,
the school that maybe doesn't even have a name. I can't remember.
I've known some schools that have like 1,000 kids in the graduating class, so
Yeah,
maybe it's something like that.
yeah,
But
I'll
yeah,
take it.
it's pretty crazy to think about.
Crazy thing. All that's the thing with the shared universe. As it grows, you're like, wait a minute. Do I need some constraints? Can I have every story connecting with
Yeah,
this?
you gotta think
Yeah,
about how it actually works and affects the rest of it.
yeah, yeah. When does the logic kind of like overweigh? I guess even the rule of cool, where
Yeah,
it's nice
yeah,
to have them all connected. You
yeah.
know.
When can you just naturally slip it in versus when you have to cut a hole in the wall that you
Yes.
created to shove it in?
Yes. Absolutely.
Then you get
Absolutely. Yeah.
then you get
Yeah.
plot holes and things.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
Um,
it's so true.
yeah. So the ending and really the kind of the story in general feels like a scaled down version of Lucy and Daniela, and this is why.
Mm,
Because it's this is why.
yeah.
Because it's just the same time, same events that are happening in a different area.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. It's happening. It's in a different gym. You know, at one point, different
Yeah, like how
room.
many gyms? Like
Place the actors.
how did these random people gain control of the gym? Where
Yeah.
what?
Yeah. It's crazy, right? They were very busy during this war. Because I
Yeah.
mean, Lucy and Daniela climax happens in like one hallway, which I picture being the same hallway a lot of actions happened in different hallways. So the
Yeah.
gym's open for Sophie to sort of take over it, you know. And I
What, she just
imagine
like has people
it just
staged
did.
in the
Yeah.
bleachers just ready to watch this?
I guess they just came, you know, maybe trying to avoid. This is why I have to write this interactive story. I have to explain how everybody gets places, how people run to the gym
Yeah,
to
really.
avoid it. They're sitting on the bleachers, you know, while other people are getting bullied in the hallways, you know.
So then
And it
there's
would
not many
explain
people
why
in
there is
there.
such a big war. Yeah,
But it
it's
made
true.
so then there wouldn't be many people in the bleachers, but because if there were, then people would just be having a war in the bleachers.
You're right.
But
You're right. So you
it
have no
feels
control.
like
Yeah.
there's a bunch of people in the bleachers when that happens. So,
Yeah.
like, is there a lot of
Yeah.
people? Is there only a few people in there? I'm
I
confused.
feel like, yeah, I feel like it's kind of up for your imagination, kind of. At
Okay.
the same time, it's like there's a bit of an audience there. There's some crowd
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
'Cause it's a gym and it's early in the day. Probably people just gathered there anyway, and some probably went there because there's a giant wedgie war going on, and the hallways are chaos with Lucy and Daniela doing crazy stuff and going through
Yeah.
deep character development. You don't want to get near
Yeah.
that. You
Yeah.
don't want to get near any of that, you know. Just stay away
So
from Daniela.
so it's
So you're
enough
hiding in the gym.
it's enough of a crowd so it's not enough of a crowd where people would start having a war.
Yeah. I think that's the best way to look at it because we know there isn't some massive war going on while Sophie's trying to have her dramatic, like evil villain moment where she's
Yeah. Like
defeated the
the
heroes and stuff. You know, there's a little there's some people there, but certainly it's mostly the Sophie show in there.
it
It's not
actually
because the war could spill into there. You would think at any moment, right? Imagine that if her like monologuing gets interrupted by just some bullies or oh sorry, we'll go, we'll leave.
yeah.
As they try and bully somebody in the gym, you know.
Yeah, they're just respecting a good bully at work. But the end,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Sophie's moment reminds me of the ending of Saw, the first Saw.
Mm, okay. Yeah, I like that where you think she's down. Yeah, yeah. I haven't seen that movie, but I obviously know
Yeah.
of that surprise twist.
Yep.
Yeah, spoiler alert for anybody who hasn't seen it. The killer is
Anybody
one of
who's
the
been able to
people
avoid it,
trying to.
really, because it's
Yeah,
so goddamn everywhere.
yeah, yeah. It's so true. Yeah. Yeah, that was certainly what I was going for there. I was going for again this sort of twist and surprise. It's like, oh, it's like they're done, like it's over. It's oh, but not really. Uh, I mean, and that's again like this idea where I had all these kind of crazy ending plots where really there'd be one more twist and Amy would be behind it or Sophie would be dead, like she would die. And, I mean, dark, crazy stuff that probably would have been tonally like super crazy out of place for the story. That just wouldn't have worked
Mhm.
um at all. But were maybe
Yeah.
fun to think about,
Yeah, I mean
and have just in mind.
that twist really was excellent, and it was just long enough between first meeting Judy and Stephanie that
Yeah.
her suspicion is pretty much gone, and the reader's guard is down. So, and then it happens like just at the right time.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and we see a little crowd too in the end sort of jump to Cara's defense.
Hmm.
And be like, oh yeah, I'm not a loser. Again, this mob mentality thing of like when you bring them to your side and what that looks like, and like fear isn't strong enough to stop people who don't want to be bullied anymore. Which is again Lucy and Daniela, but other people. So I mean, kind of the funny thing about I guess this universe of stories is like it's this whole I guess technically a whole class of people who are tired of being bullied at such a school where it's so prevalent and they're standing up to it as a large contingent, and we get to see different examples of this pocket up here and there. And I mean, the funny thing is, like, we hear about the giant war breakout and Lucy and Daniela. We get to see a little bit of the planning of it and like how it came to be such a big thing and like Kara's choice, kind of. You get a little bit of that. That like it wasn't just a small one-off thing because of Lucy and Daniela or that initial wedgie there. It's like other people were really looking to change things
Yeah.
for a little bit at this school.
Hmm.
Um, and then they got to do it in very dramatic, as you wish kind of fashion, kind of thing. Although it has a bit more consequences than as you wish, which is fun and funny to think about too. Kind of.
Something.
Although, like we said, there's no teachers to be like, "What the hell are you kids doing? You're
Yeah,
all
really.
expelled.
Yeah,
No
really. The
graduation
fuck are
for
you
any of
kids
you."
doing?
Yeah,
Get get a hold of
exactly.
yourselves. God damn.
Yeah.
uh,
No, not your underwear. Don't get a hold of that.
um, one thing that I have not thought about then that doesn't quite make sense to me anymore
Mhm.
is why it seems like the rest of the how do I say it? In the beginning of Kara's Choice, it doesn't feel like wedges really exist at all. It takes the characters forever to come to the conclusion that a wedgie exists and can happen.
Mhm.
But if it's happening in this school where bullying has been prominent for so long, why is that the case?
Yeah. It's a great question. I think because I mean, in some ways, right, when we're looking at the prologue, it wasn't always planned to be this longer story, right? As you pointed out
That's
right from
true.
the
Yeah.
beginning. That was meant to connect to like a Lucy and Daniela. It was meant to be from the very
Yeah.
beginning
Okay. That's
a
fair.
more realistic take on the fetish, and that's something to remember. So
Hmm.
not the fetish, but on how a wedgie would play out.
Yeah.
So it's not like, oh, I'm just gonna give you one because that happens. It's like we have to build to it. And has to be some thought behind why a wedgie and things
Right.
like that, and go out of our way to explain,
Right.
so it makes some sense logically. Um, Whether or not some people feel that's necessary, some I'm sure don't. But I was going for some of that, and then yeah, certainly when you then connect that to a
Makes it a little
broader
messy.
story, the question because could be like, oh, but you could retcon it too. Could have went back to the prologue maybe and tweaked some stuff and changed it. I mean, if I were to rewrite, and that's always a fun thing to think about too. Like if you were to give stories another try and rewrite the whole thing or something, what would you change? And I mean, for that, it could be maybe I make it so that other characters are more prevalent, other Lucy and Daniela esque characters. I mean, the fun maybe potential experiment project is to think, what if I brought all those stories together into one big epic volume? So like the stuff's happening simultaneously, and it's no longer multiple different stories in the same universe, but somehow one great story that's one thing, and it's just
It's an
different
epic.
almost chapters or epics, and it captures the whole history, and then we get like Homer's Odyssey but with wedgies in a school or something like that. And then we try and retcon some history around where the characters are and maybe the teachers are around. I mean, we could also assume LaQuisha and Claire kind of watching all this with great pleasure, maybe even taking pictures
Yeah,
for
you think
their
they'd be
enjoyment
involved?
later on. They'd be taking pictures, they'd be watching, they'd be in the back, like that. Like they'll see it and then they'll be like, "Should we stop this?" They'd be like, "Nah, this is
they're
like
in the
fantasy."
they're in the they're in the teachers room.
Yeah,
They're in the teachers lounge
they
every
probably
single
like
time
lock the
something.
door. They
They're
lock the door so the other teachers
not.
can't get out and stop it. They're like,
They're
"Oh, we lost the key."
they're in the teachers lounge every single time something happens, so they don't even know it happens.
Yeah, or they do because they're fetishists. They love it. Maybe they're the reason the teachers don't get involved.
Well,
I could
that's
retcon that somehow. Yeah,
it's
they somehow stopped the teachers from stopping the wedgie war. They were too into it.
you gotta remaster all your stories.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. The
That's
collectors, the game of the year edition.
yeah.
We'll call it. And
It's
we'll
the
have
wedgie.
it when, and we'll have a deleted scene where the teachers, LaQuisha and Claire, stop the rest of the teachers from stopping the fight right away through some like shenanigans. And they lose the key to get out of the teachers' lounge, and all the teachers are just banging to get out and stop it. Something like that.
It's the wedgie of the year award.
Yes. Yep. Yep.
Very nice. Um, so we come to my Which Earth segment. So when discussing realism in stories, I have a question I like to pose. Out of the four Earths I'm about to describe, which do you believe Kara's choice falls under? So you have realistic Earth, where Earth is normal as we live it every day. Alternate Earth, where Earth is changed to some degree, mainly focusing on wedgies. Idealistic Earth, where Earth is changed to fit the desires of the wedgie community or some aspect of it, depending on the writer. Or fantastical Earth, where Earth is changed to be unrecognizable, like Lord of the Rings and Dungeons and Dragons.
Mm. Yeah. Oh, what do you think? As someone who's just read it, it's probably fresh in your mind. What do you think?
Well, originally, if you had not expanded the story, I would have said realistic Earth.
Mm.
But because it's expanded and now tied into the Lucy and Daniela universe, it's got to be idealistic to me.
Yeah, sounds right. I was
Absolutely.
just after talking through it with you, I was like,
Yeah.
man, it's like in between idealistic and fantastical for how crazy they were at the end and some of the stuff that happens, like planning this rebellion or whatever,
Mhm.
like, and even just using
Yeah.
the word rebellion. But I like idealistic.
Mhm.
I like that. Yeah, it's not too far off. I mean,
Yeah, because I mean, it's
when we
something
get
that
to
we'd
real,
want to happen.
we would, yeah, we certainly would. We kind of want
It's an
everything that
ideal.
happens there to happen. At least I did. Yeah,
It's an ideal.
certainly. I
So
liked a lot of that.
it's
Yeah, I'd say
idealistic.
it's ideal for sure. For sure. Yeah. No, I like that. I think you hit it right on the head. I'm in agreement with you all the way.
Yes, yes, yes. Very nice. Is there anything else that you'd like to discuss?
No, I think you beautifully nailed it. Thank you again for the amazing questions and discussion.
Of
I
course.
love your insights and how insightful you are. I'm glad I could surprise you and probably others to realize there's a much longer story than they imagined
Yeah,
with Cara's
that was
choice.
great.
I know I know on DA, for example, like we said, it's got the prologue's got a decent number of favorites. I don't
Absolutely.
think that the other parts stack up, especially as you go longer in the story, which makes me think that people just stop reading after the
Well,
first
you
part. Is
have
that
you got six pieces of the story that you posted,
yeah,
and totally you have 50,000 between them. So
nice.
that's all
Yeah,
pretty
pretty
close
good.
numbers for it.
Yeah, pretty good. I'll
Yeah,
take it. I'm glad people have read it
absolutely. Yeah,
and
people
enjoyed
loved
it
it.
over the
You
years.
had a lot of
I'm
favorites
really
too. People enjoyed it.
yeah. Yeah, it feels like certainly a more underrated one. I don't hear much about, but I enjoyed it a lot. I still, like I said, always love that simile came up with for the dipping bird thing, and it's gonna push me just in general thinking about this to be more creative with similes and creative in how we describe wedgies, because it's so easy to just be like it cut like rope and it felt like a wire, and or like you pointed out very eloquently, like it's often we just say, oh, it resembled a thong, and like very common descriptor as well, because that's what it ends up looking like, and it's a good visual like point as well, because that's what we crave is like visual, something we can picture in
Yeah,
our mind. So stuff that's kind of easy to look at and see, say it resembles a thong. It's not hard to get into that. But
yeah,
yeah, no, this was wonderful. Super glad we got to chat about it.
definitely. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Is there anything that you'd like to promote?
Promote the best book club, which may or may not be expanding into general story discussions as well in the future, which I know I'm
Well,
all
I mean,
excited for.
if anybody's gotten this far to hear it, then I think it's worked. I think the promotion has worked.
Yeah,
Yeah,
awesome.
very nice.
Yeah, super excited for more of these episodes.
Oh
Keep
yeah.
them coming.
Mm-hmm.
I enjoyed the last few you did. How about leaving the community with Jack, my good friend Jack? That was a good one to listen to, Jackery Jack.
Yeah, definitely.
That was a fun discussion you had with him. So yeah, I'm just excited for more of those.
Absolutely. And they're fun because the people on them are having fun while we're doing them. So yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So ends another discussion with Hans Gutherson that we can proudly hang on the fridge. Thank you so much for coming on. Of
So glad to be back. Thank you. Thank you.
course. If there's anything that you'd like to hear me discuss, or if you'd like to come on for an episode, leave a comment or send me a message on DeviantArt or Lucky Fetish as New Fedora. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you on the next episode. Best of book.